Hello viewers, thank you for joining me. This was our summer-themed poll, and I know I mentioned that August feels a little late for it, the tail end of summer to me, but then I started it, and this anime takes place at the end of July, so good job on the voting. It was actually timed kind of perfectly. Summertime Rendering follows Shinpei, a boy who's been going to school in Tokyo for the past 2 years. Our story begins, however, with his first trip home to the island he grew up on. Unfortunately, what finally prompted this visit was the funeral of one of his best friends. There's an air of mystery to it all from the moment he steps off the boat. It was hard for him to believe it when he'd heard Ushio had drowned. She was known for her athleticism after all, as well as her quick temper. But then he meets back up with another childhood friend at the funeral. So, whose father is the local doctor who did the autopsy, tells him there's something especially fishy about her cause of death, because whoever made her up for the funeral covered the marks around her neck, suggesting she'd been strangled. Things get even stranger when he talks to Ushio's little sister, Mio. She tells him that, in the days leading up to the tragedy, both Ushio and the little girl she'd been trying to save that day had seen what could only be described as their own doppelgangers in the mountains around town. After asking around, they start to hear about a local legend known as the Shadow Sickness. These shadows appear as clones of the islanders, and seeing your shadow is basically an omen foretelling your death. For most people, this legend is nothing more than a ghost story, but the island's patron deity, Hiruko, is known as the Mother of Shadows, so Shinpei and Mio decide to visit the shrine to her up in the mountains and ask what the priest thinks. They don't get quite that far, though. The shrine itself seems to be deserted, but out in the wilderness behind it, they find Mio's shadow, who promptly murders them both. And that should have been the end of Shinpei's tale, except then he wakes up back on the boat on his way to the island, so we've got a time loop scenario going on here. I liked Shinpei as a main protagonist. Shadow Mio actually kills him even earlier in the second timeline, but in general, Shinpei catches on pretty quickly and immediately starts making plans to protect the people he cares about. Loop 3 is the real turning point. For the first time, Shinpei survives long enough to get to the island's summer festival on the third night, where 2 key things happen. Well, a lot of big things have already happened by this point, but for summarizing purposes, the 2 biggest things are that 1. Ushio's shadow washes up on the beach, struggling with amnesia and believing she's the real Ushio, and 2. Shinpei makes it to the end of the festival, when the shadows rise up, kill everyone, and start to envelop the world in darkness, before a new ally shoots him at the last minute, sending him back to try again. So the real stakes have been revealed now. This is the kind of anime that's actually kind of hard to spoil. There are 25 episodes in total, and even when it's moving a little slower, as it sometimes does, I can't say I have any complaints about this one feeling rushed. There are so many new developments and plot points packed into every single episode, there's no way I could spoil it all. I found this review kind of challenging to write, actually. It's always hard to look back on the really busy shows and try to sum up my experience, but I've done my best to pull out the basics, and I do have to say, this experience was a pretty great one. I've said before that I love when a show genuinely manages to surprise me. You watch enough anime, or any kind of media, and you're gonna start to recognize patterns, automatically tune in to certain story threads. Summertime Rendering was constantly throwing so many twists at me that at no point did I feel like I could start to predict what might happen in the next 10 minutes, never mind a few episodes down the road. I can't remember the last time I was genuinely this just along for the ride. It was great. I never wanted to put this one down. And I know I've mentioned plenty of times how much I love a good friendship story. One of my favorite developments was that it's not Shinpei alone against the world for very long. Starting as early as that disastrous third loop, this conflict starts to become a team effort. So's a loyal friend, It was pretty heartwarming how little he questions all the crazy things Shinpei throws at him, and I had to sympathize with him as they uncovered just how deep his family's involvement with the shadows went. Mio's the sweet little sister type, and generally very easy to like. Her story moved me a bit too, watching her balance trying to grieve her sister, trying not to let that grief inconvenience anyone else, and her determination to help fight these creatures that caused all this pain, even though any kind of violence goes against her nature. I thought everyone was written pretty well. A lot of characters grew to be a lot deeper than I was expecting them to be. There's also Hizuru, a woman Shinpei met on the boat ride over. She's revealed to be Shinpei's favorite author, writing under a pen name, and one of those books includes a storyline eerily similar to what they're experiencing now. It turns out Hizuru grew up on the island, but left as a teenager after a run-in with the shadows got her twin brother killed. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. It felt like the team grew a little with each new loop, sometimes with characters switching sides. Shadow Ushio manages to latch on to Shinpei during the festival, so she gets sent back with him to the next loop with her memories intact as well, and this continues to be the case so long as he dies in each timeline before she does. Having a shadow on their side proves to be a big advantage, and though there was a greater team, it did sometimes feel like it was these two against the world. That development wasn't too surprising, because Shinpei's long-standing crush on Ushio is introduced pretty early. Not all the developments worked in their favor, though. Each time Shinpei loops, he comes back a little later in the new timeline, so the list of things that are set in stone slowly becomes longer and longer. And the Shadow Goddess is aware of each loop too, leveling the playing field a bit for their enemies. Summertime Rendering has a great story with more twists and turns than I think anyone could keep track of, the sort of ever-evolving mystery that I love. It's rated for mature audiences, so it didn't have to pull any punches with the violence, which is also a point in its favor. The characters were all written really well. I can't say they were all likable, but the main villain was despicable in a way you kind of want the bad guy to be. I liked the soundtrack, and I thought it looked great. I want to shout out the animation specifically, because this one was done by OLM Studios, which I really only know for Pokémon, Beyblade, and a few other mostly cutesy kids shows. I don't think they have a bad reputation, but OLM isn't usually a studio that comes to mind when I think of amazing animation, so I was really impressed. You might be thinking this series sounds nigh perfect, and not exactly. I did really enjoy this one. For a little peek behind the curtain, last year I made my first Top Anime of the Year video, and I plan to do one at the end of this year too. Let's just say I had two shows that were tied for first, and now they're tied for second. Summertime Rendering was a really engaging, wild ride. I absolutely suggest checking it out if you haven't seen it. But there were a couple things I felt critical of. Really only one big thing I feel is worth mentioning here, but that one thing is entirely wrapped up in the ending, so like I said, this story had so many twists and turns that I feel like we'd have to be here for hours to properly, thoroughly spoil this show. But there will be light spoilers going forward, so be prepared for that if you're sticking with me. Both the spoiler and the complaint is that Summertime Rendering has one of those perfectly happy endings. Too perfect is the complaint. In line with the time shenanigans at the heart of this story, the conflict ends with our heroes going back in time to the day the goddess first arrived on the island, basically preventing the centuries-long shadow infestation from ever happening. With the help of someone who might surprise you, I won't spoil that part. And then we finally have to say goodbye to Shadow Ushio, but it honestly didn't feel as meaningful as it could have, because this solution means Shinpei's returning to a world where the real Ushio never died, Hizuru's brother never died, Shinpei's parents never died, reshaping a conflict I didn't even mention because the conclusion made the whole thing kinda pointless. In the original timeline, Shinpei's parents, who were marine biologists or something, stumbled across the Shadow's underground cave headquarters. They were murdered for it, of course, but officially their cause of death was an accident at sea. Anyway, after they died, Shinpei was taken in by the Kofune family and raised alongside Ushio and Mio like a brother, which made things a little awkward for his crush on Ushio, and later Mio's crush on him. It was actually the main motivation for going away to school in Tokyo, because he worried they were growing too close in the wrong way. He didn't want her to think of him as a sibling. Quite a bit of time is spent on this aspect of their love triangle, and like I said, it's just totally pointless in the long run, given how things turn out. There's no reason he couldn't have been taken in by So's family instead and just been childhood friends with Ushio. I have to give it to this show that the fan service moments usually hold some deeper meaning, but the incest bait was entirely skippable. But that was actually the less important issue for me. The bigger thing was that I felt cheated out of mourning for Ushio, and complaining about it makes me feel kind of heartless or nitpicky, but I mean, the story opens with Ushio's funeral, and then Shadow Ushio plays such a big role in the story, giving us a better look at the person her family and friends lost, all the while knowing that we'll eventually have to say goodbye to her, too. But that loss is ultimately pretty empty, and it definitely left me wanting for something. I was just so ready for her to be this tragic, sacrificial figure, and I love a good happy ending, but I love a good, cathartic, bittersweet sort of ending, too, and I felt like this show would have been better suited to that flavor of conclusion. But it was a good ending, even if I'd wanted something a little different. A good ending to a really great story, so I'll repeat that you should definitely check this one out if you haven't seen it. Thank you all for voting it in, and thank you for watching.